All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. So thanks everybody for joining us today. This is brought to you, of course, by EU DisinfoLab. So EU DisinfoLab is an independent NGO focused on researching and tackling dis and misinformation campaigns that are targeting the EU and its member states. Our research is very multifaceted, so we continuously monitor disinformation activities across social platforms to identify trends and threats. And in addition to this, we use open source investigation techniques to uncover disinformation networks and campaigns. Our findings are then disseminated via our partnerships and to media leading experts and to policymakers. And this last stakeholder group is really why we're here today now. We really try to influence legislation and policy relating to dis and misinformation. And so we are the advocacy policy side of the team. I'm Claire Pershan, policy coordinator, and this is my colleague Rita Jonusaite, our advocacy coordinator. And we'll be presenting to you today our work around the Digital Services Act. So just quickly, before I hand it over to Rita, we decided 2 years ago to begin working on the DSA. And we did that because we had been somewhat frustrated by platform initiatives on their own and by self-regulation. And so we took the opportunity to advocate around regulation around legislation in order to have a legal framework to look at some of these issues. And 2 years later, we're very happy to share with you now the fruits of a lot of hard work from civil society groups, many groups besides ourselves, and also, of course, the work of the EU institutions and lawmakers. A few housekeeping notes: this webinar is being recorded. There will be time for, we will be also receiving questions through the chat. And one last note is that next Wednesday, we will be having another webinar with Tremo, which is a trust and safety content moderation solution provider. And we'll be speaking with them about the DSA as well, and specifically how the DSA will impact and kind of raise the stakes and the obligations on some smaller online platforms. All right.
Yeah, so essentially this slide is kind of summarizing what Claire just told you about different kind of activities that the EU DisinfoLab is doing. So I'm not going to get into that and go maybe straight into the Digital Services Act. So what the Digital Services Act FOSS is all about, what is it, why we are talking about it? The Digital Services Act is indeed a landmark legislation on internet safety and platform accountability. It essentially will make sure that platforms are responsible on what we are doing with their services and what kind of experience users are getting, as well as you will see a bit later on throughout the presentation that the platforms will be required to share much more information with the users, also with researchers and also regulators in terms of what's actually happening on their platforms. Before getting into the details, we thought it's interesting to let you know that contrary to maybe what you have heard, if you follow the Digital Services Act discussions, it's not only about very large online platforms or very large online search engines such as Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or Google. The Digital Services Act actually covers a lot of different services. It brings different obligations to smaller online platforms, what Claire also mentioned, also to online marketplaces, app stores, cloud and web hosting services, and also internet service providers. But obviously, considering that the work that the EU DisinfoLab is doing in the community to whom the webinar is aiming to provide insights and clarifications in terms of what tools and rights the Digital Services Act is giving to organizations and entities fighting disinformation, the focus is on very large online platforms and search engines and the smaller online platforms as such. But just for you to know that indeed the scope of the legislation is much broader than you might have heard in the media in the past months. I think it is important to mention why we are doing this. The Digital Services Act has been a discussion in Brussels bubble for the last 1.5 to 2 years or so. It caught a lot of attention of civil society organizations here and decision makers, but us at the EU DisinfoLab got a feeling that essentially and what rights and tools users such as you, organizations, as I said, fighting disinformation would be having once the legislation is Brussels lingua thing, and find a way how to present all that vital information for your future work in a bit more accessible language. We did try our best to translate it into something what would be easy to read, and as you can see, we took this question format. So to say, really trying to put ourselves in your shoes, what would be the key questions when I look at the Digital Services Act and how it can be useful in my work? And indeed, as I said, translated to a more approachable and user-friendly format. And that's also because the successful implementation of the Digital Services Act will be a collective effort. It's not only us sitting here in Brussels who would be pushing forward decision makers or service providers to implement what's written in the Act. It's very much the community, again, using the tools and advocating also on the national level to the national governments and to service providers there. So your role essentially is key, and that's why it's important for us to make sure as much as we can that you are aware of what the Digital Services Act is offering to you. Going forward, last note before going into details of the user guide that we wanted to highlight is the fact that there has been also a lot of discussion that Digital Services Act has a lot to do with illegal content. But what's important to understand is that indeed the DSA is taking more of a system approach when it comes to improving our online environment and information sphere, which means that content that is so-called lawful but awful, including disinformation, would be also in scope when we are talking about risk assessments, when we are talking about terms and conditions of the platforms. And this is what we are focusing on in this webinar and in our user guide. There are a lot of provisions. Claire mentioned 74 articles. A lot of them have to do with the illegal content, but our focus is really letting you understand which article specifically, sometimes maybe not even explicitly mentioning it, would be useful for the counter disinformation community in your work. And diving deep into the tools and the rights that we keep mentioning. So as I said, we're really looking into this through the question format. So the first question that came to our mind was, so would the Digital Services Act make a difference for you in terms of how you're reporting disinformation? And actually, that's not the case. The Digital Services Act, you'll see a bit later, is putting forward mandatory requirements to establish reporting systems for illegal content, but none of it applies to disinformation. So essentially, you would be using the same reporting mechanisms that multiple platforms usually have included in their services. So here, nothing specifically changes. What does change, what the DSA change and what is important is the user redress and appeals mechanism. And that was one of the key aspects for our advocacy in the negotiation process in the last months and in the last two years. Looking into practical tools that would help you in everyday work, reporting on disinformation and getting an answer from the platforms. We were focusing on two specific articles, Article 17 and Article 18. Article 18 deriving from the first one. Article 17 on internal complaint handling system, as I said, has been the key in our advocacy because this will allow to complain about platforms' content moderation decisions, including over moderation and under moderation, which in practice means that you would be able to complain about platform's decision not to moderate the content, so not to address disinformation that you spotted and report it to the platform. Essentially, that would open a message button that often is stuck on the platform's service, and they just simply don't react to these reports. So that gives you a very, very concrete tool how this can be brought up again and try to get redress. It is a big win for the EU DisinfoLab, but also for other civil society organizations that have been working on this in the last months. And then, as I said, it links to Article 18, out of court dispute settlement body, also being established under the DSA, which would allow to challenge decisions under Article 17. Essentially, if you as a user, you reported disinformation, nothing has been done, or you think that it was not adequately addressed, you complained using mechanisms under Article 17 and did not receive a response that would be satisfactory, you would still have a third option to go and complain to this external body, independent body, which is a great thing for the counter-disinformation community, considering the fact that disinformation per se in most member states and also under European law is not illegal. So normally this is not something what you would be able to bring to the court. You would have an additional tool to seek redress. So that's, again, as I said, a very big win for us and hopefully for you, as long as the tools are being used by the community. Another important provision that maybe have not received as much coverage in the discussions, but is very important, is an article on representation, which basically means that you as a user would be able to mandate an organization, an entity, to represent your rights under the DSA, including Article 17, Article 18, and all the other rights that the DSA gives to you. On the other hand, it would allow you as an organization to become an organization that is representing victims of disinformation. So that's another avenue for engagement. And another thing that we wanted to highlight there, and you probably have seen in our user guide, is the fact that, for example, complaints under Article 17 submitted by an entity that is certified under this Article 68 would get a priority. So essentially, if you discover a malicious network spreading disinformation, and if you are holding this status, your appeal would be dealt with quicker. So that's additional thing. But what happens when so these are all the provisions how to deal with the disinformation that is already online. What happens, or like what platforms will be doing, and what could be your role to contribute to reducing the spread of disinformation in the first place? Here, the risk assessments and risk mitigation measures are important. So basically, platforms will need to do assessments how their services are contributing to perpetuating systemic risks, including disinformation. They will need to look into things like algorithms. We will need to look into content moderation, terms of services, ads, collection of data, all of these kind of things. And essentially, if they don't put forward proper mechanisms to address these risks, they would be fined by the Commission. It's important to mention these articles do apply specifically to very large online platforms and search engines only. Hence the Commission. Claire will mention it a bit later, so I'm not diving more into details here. But again, here to stress out, that in the DSA it specifically mentions civil society organizations could be consulted by the platforms when they look into their systemic risks and design risk mitigation measures, which basically gives solid ground for organizations like you to ask for a seat at the table and be a part of these discussions and bring in your expertise. Another thing very much linked to that that we wanted to bring forward to your attention, you probably have seen the new revamped code of practice on disinformation has been recently launched. And the questions are, so how it actually links to the DSA. Not getting too much into details in terms of what's in the actual code, what is important to highlight in terms of the DSA is that the idea is that the code of practice on disinformation will become code of conduct under Article 35. That will enable very large online platforms and search engines to take it as a risk mitigation measure on disinformation, which also means that if they fail to comply with the code of practice on disinformation, future code of conduct, they could be fined on that non-compliance. So that would be a very strong incentive for blogs and the search engines to actually comply with it. What's also important for you to know that you are able to complain about platforms infringing regulation to your digital service coordinators. I know it sounds bizarre, the name, Claire explained it in the detail just in a couple of minutes time. But essentially, you as an organization looking into how platforms behave and how they are addressing systemic risks and beyond that, would be able to bring forward the fact that they are not complying with the regulation. And that's what is ensured through the Article 43 mentioned right here. Yes, and then a couple of more things from my side to mention, assuming that I'm running a bit out of time. In terms of the illegal content, as we said, we are not specifically focusing on this in our user guide, considering that most of our community is not really working on illegal content, but it's important for you to know that indeed Article 14 establishes specific reporting mechanisms or mandates platforms to establish specific reporting mechanisms on illegal content. So that will definitely have to be in place, and it very much links to statement of reasons under Article 15 in the DSA, which means that platforms would need to explain why they made certain content moderation decisions. And here it's very important also to stress that it's not only about illegal content, but also on content that is incompatible with platforms' terms and conditions, including disinformation. So essentially, you would get much more clarity of why certain content was taken down or not, and what are the reasons. Essentially, there has been a lot of narrative around this opening the black box of algorithms, but it's beyond the algorithms, really understanding better what is happening with the content moderation decisions, and it will help us to hopefully improve the online safety. And last but not least, from my side, if you looked into the DSA or our user guide, you'll see there is a specific provision on the trusted flaggers. So DSA establishes specific trusted flaggers category dealing with illegal content. So entities reporting on illegal content whose submissions reports would be dealt with priority. Does it affect the trusted flagger status if you have one with different social media platforms when it comes to disinformation? According to our reading, and again, we are not necessarily legal experts in this, but based on our reading, it shouldn't. It does allow platforms when, in addition to having DSA trusted flaggers on illegal content, have different arrangements with entities and organizations when it comes to all the other services that we provide and content that we deal with. So that should not change under the DSA either. And I'm done talking and I give it to Claire.
Great. Yes, and so one thing to mention also, as you can see, is we're not going through the whole DSA, right? The DSA is 74 articles. We're giving you a handful of articles. These are the key ones for us that largely relate to disinformation as we understand it. But for things that relate more to illegal content and for many of the other obligations on other types of services, we're not going into this. So we can point you to other resources there, but we're really pretty focused, as you can see in this webinar and in this guide. But one thing, of course, that will be critical to disinformation experts is data. And the DSA is going to be a data generating machine. It's going to create important new data sets that will help us kind of look under the hood, right, for what's happening in platforms and to understand better some of these systemic challenges that Rita explained around the systemic risks. And then also, as Rita mentioned, the code of practice on disinformation is incredibly important. It will also create many, many important data sets. A lot of this is defined, some of these key performance indicators, some are even yet to be defined. So we're going to walk you through some of the data sets that will come from the DSA, but these are in addition to, in some cases, data that will also come from the code of practice. So there will be transparency reporting required from all of the intermediary services in the DSA, and these are scaffolded obligations. So the intermediary services will have kind of the fewest reporting obligations, and then the BLOPs, the largest online platforms, will have the most reporting obligations. And these will be, so the minimum obligations will be annual reports about content moderation processes like the use of automated tools, their inaccuracies and possible error rates, also training for people in charge of content moderation, and also information about the complaints that Rita was describing earlier, and also government removal requests. Next, so on online platforms, moving up a tier with more obligations, there are more obligations around reporting illegal content. And in fact, the European Commission is going to create a database of illegal content that has been reported. Also, there will be the number of notices from trusted flaggers will need to be reported, and some further information related to complaints, like the time it took to resolve them, information related to Article 18, this out-of-court dispute settlement, and then also, of course, on the size of their user base. So all online platforms are going to have to report every 6 months how many users they have. And this is critical because based on how many users they have in the EU, they will or will not be designated as a very large online platform. So this 6 months reporting is critical to understand when they should have that next tier of obligations when they become very large online platforms. And so when they enter that highest tier, they'll have even more reporting, which will be around their human resources in content moderation, and also in relation to each official language in the EU. And then more detail about the people that are doing that work, their expertise and training and support, and then their annual audits and information about their systemic risks and risk mitigation measures, because as Rita mentioned, also those measures 26 and 27, those articles relate to the very largest online platforms. There are also a lot of important changes that will come from relate to user-facing transparency, relating to how users can see and understand that they're looking at online ads, and also understanding recommendation systems. We're not going to go into this for the sake of time, but especially because we didn't focus as much on these articles, and there's a lot to say about them. They're very important for disinformation and for other online disorders, but we'd rather point you to experts who've been really focused on these elements. And further, there's going to be more work that will come from the code of practice also on these issues. Ad libraries are very important to disinformation researchers. So the very largest online platforms should set up searchable public interfaces where they can kind of look at some key criteria around ads. So the targeting criteria, the time that the ad was online, things like the person on whose behalf the ad was shown, who paid for the ad, et cetera. So this is In some cases, platforms already have this, right? But this is mandating it now for all flops. And again, there's more stuff that's going to go into ads that will be clarified in the code of practice that we won't go into here. So very important is going to be the DSA's Article 31, which is on data access and scrutiny. So the very largest online platforms will have to set up have to set up pathways to share data related to their compliance. So we'll have to share data with compliance with the digital service coordinators, but also with vetted researchers. And here, vetted researchers can be understood as both those related to research institutions, but also in some cases to nonprofits. And this, the DSA refers to a specific article in a copyright directive, and so we'll point you there. But the understanding as of now is that this is not just academics in the strict sense, this is more open than that. The DSA is going to lead to a delegated act in this area. It also relates here to the code of practice. So I don't want to share more information than we have at this time, but the idea is that through a laid out process, experts, these sorts of vetted researchers will be able to get access to data sets. Now, these data sets have to be related to compliance. So they have to be related to the systemic risks, to understanding those systemic risks, or to mitigating them. That is still very wide when we're looking at disinformation, because disinformation is a very obvious systemic risk. So that will not be a barrier. It just makes sense that, of course, data access is related to compliance. And so moving on next. So a lot of people right now in our community are wondering what's happening with CrowdTangle. And we can't tell you, we don't know exactly what's happening with CrowdTangle, but we can tell you what the DSA is now encouraging related to CrowdTangle type data. In this area, the DSA was very inspired by some of the progress that CrowdTangle made, CrowdTangle being Facebook's transparency tool. And so the VLOPs should give access in real time to researchers, the researchers who were vetted, who I explained before. They should give them access to, if possible, so if technically feasible, in real time, to data that's publicly available on the platform's online interface. So already publicly available data, and a lot of this data would match up with the type of data you may have seen already with CrowdTangle that relates to kind of aggregated interactions from public pages or public figures, shares, comments, reach types of, this type of data. So again, this is a lot of the detail is yet to come on this, but just that the DSA opens the door for this and really encourages this kind of data sharing. All right, so now looking more about some of the enforcement questions, because the text is nothing if not properly enforced. So who's responsible for enforcing this? Now, the DSA has taken an interesting path, which is that the largest platforms are going to be overseen by the European Commission. This is to ensure that the regulator has the adequate resources and authority to properly regulate. So the rest of the services, so smaller online platforms, the other intermediary services, will be regulated by a digital service coordinator in the member state where they are legally based, or where they are legally established. That is kind of this two-tier system. And so yes, each member state will be required to name, of course, a digital service coordinator. They can have multiple authorities, but they need to have one digital service coordinator. So what are some of the new powers of these digital service coordinators? They will have actually some really critical authorities when it comes to the articles that we were describing to you, because they will have the ability to provide access to data requests, to vet and approve the access to data requests under Article 31 that I was just describing. They'll be able to designate trusted flaggers under Article 19. They'll be able to designate out-of-court dispute settlement bodies, those that Article 18 level, when you can sort of take your appeal to another body. And they'll be able to also receive complaints, as Rita described, under Article 43. So they'll also, of course, have relevant to compliance related data because their role is compliance. And they'll be able to conduct on-site inspections. So DSCs are going to be very, very important. And in many cases, we don't know who the DSCs will be in different member states. So stay tuned, and we'll definitely be happy to point you towards some experts who are working on this topic very closely. So the digital service coordinators will all come together to create a European board for digital services. And so this is an EU level independent advisory group that will oversee the proper application of the DSA. The board can invite experts and observers to its meetings and may cooperate with external experts. So theoretically, the European board should be available to civil society to give input. Again, this is not exactly clear, but it's going to be important for us to make sure that the European board has an open ear. It is technically possible under our reading of the DSA, at least, for us to sit in theoretically on some of their meetings. So question. What happens if your DSC in your member state is not doing their job properly? So maybe they're not resourced, maybe they haven't, inspected properly a platform that you have reason to believe is infringing the regulation. Maybe they, haven't been responsive to some of your requests. What can you do? So DSCs are, the DSCs, first of all, they'll have to have adequate resources normally because they'll be mandated to be able to have the resources to oversee the platforms that are in their jurisdiction. So normally they should have sufficient resources from the start, but of course we can't expect this necessarily. And so if you're having problems with the digital service coordinator in your member state, you can seek help perhaps from the digital service coordinator of the establishment of the service that you're looking at. Also, in some cases, when an issue relates to 3 member states, the digital service coordinators can refer the issue to the board, which can then mandate or ask the digital service coordinator in question to take action on that platform. So there are ways that the board and that other digital service coordinators together can still put pressure. And then again, keep in mind that the very largest online platforms are still overseen by the Commission. So if your problem relates to one of these very largest online platforms, the Commission is the authority in charge in those cases. So some scenarios. What if your trusted flagger request is denied by your digital service coordinator, or your research request is denied, or so what if those 2 things didn't go through in your member state digital service coordinator? So we've, as civil society groups, really tried hard to make sure that there was some kind of appeals process for this. We didn't exactly get this, but the European Commission is going to establish an independent agency to advise on appeals in this area, and to advise on the vetting process in this area. And so hopefully there will be some kind of appeals process that will be able to happen through this new advisory agency. So again, this has to be detailed, but we hope that it will not just be a closed door, that there should be other ways. So who can you contact at each platform regarding the regulation? As I mentioned quickly, each service will have to set up a legal representative and also a point of contact. Sometimes these will be the same person. So even if the platform is not based in an EU member state, they'll still have to establish a legal representative in a member state, and that person will be your point of contact as well. All right. So EU DisinfoLab has been very focused in the last year or so on something called the media exemption, which fortunately did not make it into the final text. So the media exemption was a possible amendment that would have basically given a carte blanche for media or publisher content to not be subject to content moderation under the DSA, even if that content violated platform's terms and conditions. So it's kind of giving a free card to potential disinformation if it was just from a media. And this was clearly very difficult and problematic for us as people who investigate disinformation on all kinds of media, all kinds of platforms, just everywhere, right? So we didn't want to have a carve out just because something is qualified as media. So very fortunately, and thanks to a lot of advocacy from a lot of different civil society actors, we were able to strike down all different variations of the media exemption and make sure that this regulation remains horizontal and applies to everyone, and that all content that may contain disinformation is subject to terms and conditions. So we're very happy with that outcome, but that was a lot of work, I can tell you that. And finally, I think that's everything from my side. Yeah, over to Rita.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks, Claire. So briefly, what happens next? What happens now? We actually didn't time it to that, but coincidentally, today the DSA is the agreed text, the political text is being adopted in the European Parliament plenary. So we have something to celebrate. It still needs to be formally adopted by the Council, potentially in September, maybe a bit later, we still don't know. And then it would normally come into force or become a real law sometime towards the end of the year, probably November, which means it after being published in the official journal of the EU. What we are saying in terms of a timeline, just a bit of a spoiler alert, this is all based on our intel that we gathered. None of it is specifically written in somewhere. This is based on knowledge that, as I said, that we gathered and a bit of a common sense. So it might be some imprecisions when it comes to specific months, but that's essentially how it's going to look. And then next year is actually going to be quite important in a sense that the Commission is planning or hoping that in the first quarter of the next year, we will already be able to designate very large online platforms and search engines and actually invoice them for the supervisory fee. We did not specifically focus on this in our presentation, but when we're thinking about the enforcement of the regulation, of course, the question comes, who's going to pay for that? At least when it comes to very large online platforms and search engines, they basically going to pay for themselves to be overseen. So once they're designated, invoices would come forward, the Commission would be able to hire people to ensure there is compliance. Then after being designated, very large online platforms and search engines will have approximately, well, they will have exactly actually 4 months to prepare to comply with the regulation, which is interesting because essentially the regulation applies to very large online platforms and search engines earlier than for the rest of the service providers. The law for the rest enters into force or applies only from 2024, beginning of the year. Also, what is interesting for you to know in terms of a timeline, that after the designation, Commission is hoping that platforms, very large online platforms and search engines would provide initial risk assessments already towards the end of the year or in the fourth quarter of 2023. So this is the kind of timeline we are looking at. And as I said, we are just gathering information and data, how it potentially is going to look like. It can shift a couple of months here and there, but that's what we are dealing with now. So next year is going to be a lot about blogs and very large search engines, and for the Commission preparing the compliance of them to the regulation. Yes, and I think that's about it with the timeline. And we are heading into the questions. Yeah, essentially, just to highlight, forgot about this slide. Just to highlight that indeed the DSA, if not properly implemented and enforced, will be a repeated mistake that we have seen with the enforcement of GDPR. It is a beautifully written law, has a lot of good things in it, but it also has to work. And I think this is, again, somewhere the role of civil society organizations, not only in Brussels, but across the member states, is going to be very, very important. We will also need to look into best practices, and where, for example, digital service coordinators are working better and are able to deliver better, and what are the conditions for that, and maybe other digital service coordinators could be learning from them, and civil society could definitely play that role in pushing for better enforcement and for these good practices to actually be implemented elsewhere. So there, your engagement again will be critical. We are also happy to hear from you if you want to let us know that something is or isn't working, and where applicable, we can definitely use it for our advocacy on the European level when it comes to enforcement of the regulation of blobs and search engines. Yeah, it's the time for questions. So far as we can see, there are no specific questions. And something is appearing. So basically, what weaknesses, the question, if I can voice it, what weaknesses do you see with the regulation? Is there any mechanism here for updating the rules in the future if loopholes appear, etc.? Okay, so in terms of the weaknesses, essentially, as we mentioned, the key thing will be enforcement. There is a bit of a worry across civil society if there's going to be enough resources to make sure that it works, because that's the key thing. We would not necessarily call it a weakness of the regulation, but it is a crucial part of it. When it comes to updating rules in the future, yes, a revision of the regulation is foreseen. It's a common thing in the EU law. If I'm not mistaken, from the top of my head, 5 years after entry into force, there would be a process that would allow to look into how the regulation is working and if certain things need to be adapted. A second question, Carlos is wondering if there is some specific information about calculations of number of users regarding designation of blobs. Will it be a good faith declaration by platforms? So essentially, this is still a process to be figured out. There are provisions in the DSA how this designation should look like, but at least to our understanding, we still need to see how it will work in practice.
Yeah, and the auditors, the digital service coordinator will be able to audit this to kind of verify, I believe, as they would be able to audit anything else that's under their jurisdiction in the DSA. So there is a way to check that platforms are doing this in good faith. It's not entirely just based on the numbers that they would share.
But essentially, platforms will be initially sharing their own numbers.
Yeah, and it's a super critical question, and it depends on exactly how you count this. And if I'm not mistaken, this might go to secondary legislation, even possibly, of exactly how this number should be counted. But we don't know as of now exactly how this number is going to be counted.
Yeah. And a question on the role of auditors with regards to disinformation. Essentially, when it comes to very large online platforms and search engines, as auditors will need to look into how they are dealing with the systemic risks, including disinformation, what measures they put forward. They will at the same time will be looking into disinformation for the platforms that are facing this problem. Essentially, everybody is facing the problem. So yes, auditors will have a role to look into that.
Yeah, and for people who like reports, these audit reports are supposed to be public, so we should dive into them and also see what comes out of this reporting, specifically from the auditors. And let's see, we seem to be, we have some questions in the chat too, which is great. Ideally put them in the Q&A, but the chat is also fine. So this question is about the CrowdTangle analogy, asking does the DSA require platforms to give access to data in real time? So it doesn't exactly require this, no. And we're only talking about VLOPs, the very largest online platforms, but it says in a recital 64, I believe, that the very large online platforms should give, when possible, when technically possible, they should make publicly accessible data like CrowdTangle data available to those researchers and including the nonprofits who also fit these criteria. So there are some caveats, but as I said, this was inspired by CrowdTangle, and the idea is that if this data is publicly accessible already, the idea is that it should be an interface that then these researchers can access in real time. So maybe it will not be technically possible, right, for the VLOP, but the hope is that it would be. And we have more questions coming in.
Do we have any intel on when the Commission will present draft delegated acts? So for example, on data access and scrutiny, and are there plans to engage in these and how? No, at this very point in time, we haven't heard the Commission at least starting working on this. Very likely, because again, we are in the process of finalizing the adoption of it. To our best knowledge, but this is definitely likely will start after the summer break. Here in Brussels, everybody is already thinking about summer vacations. I don't know about you, but everybody here does. Commission, the Parliament, everybody. So that is probably going to be pushed to that. But civil society organizations will be pushing for delegated acts, specifically, for example, linked to Article 31, to be a priority for the Commission to work on. When it comes to plans on engaging on these, I'm not sure if that's specifically linked to, specifically addressed to EU DisinfoLab, or more generally, civil society will definitely be focusing on that. From our side, we will need to see where it makes sense to put our resources, again, because we have fantastic experts in when it comes to data access here in Brussels that have been engaging throughout the negotiation processes already, specifically on the data aspect, and doing a great job. So we'll need to see if that makes sense for us very actively engage rather than just following, making sure that it goes in the right direction.
Yeah, and one last thing specifically on the Article 31, a lot of the work that would inform the delegated act around data access and scrutiny has already been put forward in the code of practice, the strengthened code of practice, which is now available. We can try to drop that in the chat later, or you can find that by searching for it. But the idea is that there's been a lot of thinking already around this. Also, EDMO has released sort of best practices around data access for research. So hopefully this delegated act won't take too long because of all the thought and work that's already gone into it.
Great.
Okay.
It seems there are no additional questions. I think maybe just one of the sort of last comments from our side is that it's all still a bit in process. For us, also for legislators here in Brussels, to figure out how this is going to all work in practice. Putting heads together and trying to find the best way to have, yeah, indeed, to improve information space for everybody, to have safer internet, safer user experience. A lot of the things that we discussed today, it's also our best reading of the legislation that has been agreed upon. While we don't expect any major changes as such, it will all depend on the interpretation as well. So that's maybe a bit of a caveat to keep in mind. We will be engaging throughout upcoming years, definitely looking into how the DSA is being implemented. And again, there is our biggest added value from the EU DisinfoLab perspective, to engage and maybe advocate for certain things. But this is what we can share with you today. This is the knowledge that we have, and I'm pretty sure maybe when it comes in, when the DSA comes into force, you will definitely have a better understanding on what's happening on the national level. Maybe then we would be happy to, to have a conversation around that when the time comes, and share that intel. It's always very useful. Yeah, but this is where we stand today.
Yeah, I think just to reiterate, it really matters so much, it's enforcement in different member states. And if there are people on this webinar now or who are watching it later, and you already know maybe who is going to be your digital service coordinator, or you have some thoughts about other digital service coordinators or questions, definitely share them, because I think it's really important to start thinking now about how the resourcing is going to go in terms of enforcing the text everywhere.
Yeah, that's basically it. If you find the user guide useful for you and maybe for your community or wider network, feel free to share it. as a part of closing words, we also wanted to encourage if you have resources to translate it, maybe to your local language, just to make it more accessible. We do fully understand, but not everybody would necessarily be comfortable with an English version, and maybe would be more useful if it's in another language. There are no specific copyright rights on this, so feel free to do that. But we would encourage if you could drop us a line to let us know, just because, again, some things are still being clarified. We might update the user guide as the time goes, adding additional things, or maybe specifying some things. So for you to have the newest version of it would be great if before doing any translations, you drop us a line. Great. And I see there is something.
One more comment, but we're also a bit over time. So yeah, thank you everybody for joining. And
that's great.
Stay in touch. We have our emails, maybe. No, we don't. That's okay. They're in the user guide. Okay.